The book opens with a prose piece, and it's a straightforward, discursive, sometimes descriptive piece of prose which addresses a particular setting in which exclusions take place. And then as the book proceeds, it moves through various other forms until what it ends with is a single short lyric. And one of the things that I'm interested in, that the book's interested in, is the movement from prose to lyric and the question of when the lyric poem becomes useful or necessary to the discussion. Feedback 1. We are not done. After the April we had, and the August and the January, rain cleaned down against the dooryard steps, setting out the way that architecture separates things, places, persons, trees, bread, the way the documents stack up, out with the space set by to read them. Think how short time thou hast abiden here, airports, certain outskirts of our cities, after the process, the way the judgments foreclose. After the December and all the elements left lying around us, when the winds blow and the seas whose steadfast faith yet never moved, process no change of rule, only the direction of governance, persons disregarded, after the borders closed. After the process, after the wreckage in transmission, the rain, the repetition, world without end, in the streets we are not done. This is unfinished business, outside standing, constructing space. So I started to write the poems of Through pretty much immediately after I completed the poems which were part of my previous book, All Just. And the poems included in Through were largely written for particular occasions. So there's a scene in Canterbury which is a kind of performance scene, and the poem Feedback and the poem Through and the poem The Archaeology of Walking were all written for performance at a particular occasion in Canterbury, as part of Canterbury's Sounds New Poetry Festival. And in each of those cases, the part of the point was that I would write a poem and then it would be delivered, and then another poet would respond with their poem. So these were poems written into a performative context. 2. This much we can say. Insistence is part of the argument, coming back to a person's bearing, the way a body rests, notwithstanding the story. Was never man so like among us? Separate, I don't believe it, that chit-chit-chat. Part of the argument. The dooryard echoes in winter, so the sound passes through of somebody else's emergency. Abide and hear, restricted in every particular. It was on the following day he fell from grace. Within a budding grove, a person designated, uninvited. J'ai eu pitié des autres, probablement assez. I don't think so, hardly enough. So like my life while it will last, the principle, elements shorn from context. And somewhere we might stand to contemplate an open environment. I learned something recently, that we lack tact at our airports, certain part of the argument, talking simply, face to face. Feedback itself is in 9 sections. Short, it's their lyric length poems, 9 lyric length poems. And one of the things that Feedback is trying to do, which the other poems in the book are trying to do, is probe the parts of the language, and especially those parts of the language that are concerned with relations between things and between people. So one of the sections of the book is called Syntax, where it's precisely what it's doing is exploring how in language people relate to one another. What are the terms which allow those relations to take place? 3. Then there is the question of measure, continuously monitoring and modelling, in which circumstance I want to specify blood and bone, gesture, motion, aught else the world can offer. A woman in the garden sings a cradle song, trending. A plane goes down. Maybe if we sift the fragments, look down on the skyline, scarcely credible on such a scale. Our all we have, held together by spit and syntax. Moments in the process when affection yields. Discourse. I think we should sue today for no compassion, since these practices among us have functioned long enough. Break open the argument, the story that shuts up our territory, bodies governed outside the scope of law. Subject to change. I get a call about Dover, and in the garden, the lady singing gets our reports to match. Sirens, cigarettes, she is a credible witness, subject to process. the sun kicks back. One of the pieces that I wrote, which came out in the Los Angeles Review of Books, was an essay about the Dover Immigration Removal Center. The Dover Immigration Removal Center is a chilling and troubling and kind of horribly fascinating building. It's a place where, in theory, people who are due to be deported are detained under UK rules indefinitely. So a removal centre is a place where a person in this country is a place where a person can be detained for months or years. The Dover Immigration Removal Centre, as I discuss in that essay, and as other people have discussed, I'm not the only person to mention this, is kind of symbolically interesting precisely because it stands where it stands, exactly on the White Cliffs of Dover. It occupies what was formerly a Napoleonic fort, a building that has gone through various different incarnations. It is, to all intents and purposes, a prison. So it stands there on the White Cliffs of Dover, one of the most iconic topographical sites in the country, announcing a certain kind of refusal of people who would seek asylum in this country. And not only does it announce that refusal, but it kind of places people who have sought asylum in a situation where they are rendered almost entirely powerless. So in the essay, I try to consider what this site means. And the poems have a relation to that essay because they are considering the linguistic questions that arise from the state of exception. 4. This is a song for lovers. The wreckage is part of the urgency. You send today, text me a scrap of life. Exact words, therefore simply does what is to be done. Last thing, put some kind of document together. Something we can trade on, the history of a conversation broken only by the moments the networks went down as we talked, getting most things wrong, except perhaps the deep are done here. Last thing, to exercise your faculties at large. I live at the foot of a hill, look out over an ancient city. At 3 in the morning, the traffic stops, leaving only sirens the way things go, echoing gracelessly as we go. At 4, birdsong. At 6, start up, and all the while process, gesture, motion, until his action is a reality. Long we sing by rote, shaping to intervene. This is a song for lovers, and aught else the world can show. One of the words that keeps coming back in the poem through is the word document, and this is because the poem is deeply interested in what we do document and what we don't document, and what the culture chooses to document and what it doesn't document, and it's a source of constant surprise and anxiety to the poem that certain processes are fully documented and certain processes are not fully documented. This is one of the questions that the poem is trying to address itself to. 5. And the truth is, there aren't many images. February, the news breaks, the snow won't last. In the hoarfrost we contemplate obscure attachments, sleep pattern broken, future indefinite, and the realization for like the millionth time, there is no context for the argument to be put, which we should make only a person presenting disparate attributes, notwithstanding a song thrush nails the neighborhood into place. And not for the first time, though this is snow in February, and where the letter finishes, it doesn't say who wrote, only the way things go, which is somebody's emergency, aggression rendered in its most accurate form. With only the process laid out. The laying out is part of the process. I lay this out. I had to learn the simplest things last, and I am writing to say that the buck stops where I stop, and the snow melts, and the context falls into place. The poem is trying to be very aware that there are processes taking place which are performing an exclusionary function. And it is not unimportant, it seems to me, that the poem has this awareness, because this is part of the poem's context. It absolutely is. And so the poem has to understand that part of what it has to address, or a central part of what it has to address, is that process which is performing that exclusionary function. 6. Today is pale. I'd like to make an intervention now, please. Across the city, the traffic never stops. When the winds blow and the seas and the small rain arbitrates the process, and the waiting continues and the watching, I'd like to interrupt. From rupture to break, I record that a person's bearing is not now constitutional in a court of law, that the emergency is this, the last book of songs and airs where we have wandered all our ways, the which on earth do spring. Through cowslips and kingcups at certain outskirts of our cities, clustered in bedless houses whereby the franchise stops, bordered, held at bay, not granted access to the currency, bid her therefore herself soon ready make, bid her herself soon make, out of the fragments we left lying around us. Fragmentation is part of the process, turning things out. This is a song for lovers, gathering, arbitrating, proposing tact. I guess the importance of Olson is the way he turns the form of the poem towards the politics of the poem. So Olson arrived at a very open sense of what the poem is. He actually called it open field poetics. And in arriving at that open field poetics, what he's trying to explore is what it means to have what he calls a polis, which is to say a community, which is constantly seeking to reach further out and to extend itself so that it becomes possible to allow in more voices and more participants and more actors. Olson is not without his flaws, and he didn't achieve this entirely, and there are of course difficulties with his work, but that formal question of how as a writer you open your writing up to more voices and other voices and a larger sense of what it means to be within a community, that seems to me a very important thing that Olson does. 7. This is the object. To constitute a modern document, put the pieces together in the open the way the days fall out. You call after you make your report. Reporting is part of the process, and the rain is, and the way the blackbird. You contemplate questions I decline to ask. Even such is time. The object is to constitute a context. Where I live is, the house is back towards an ancient church where Ethelbert married Bertha. This is not my position. Questions not possible to formulate before a court of law. Even such is time, finding herself not 20 miles north of Dover, where the language stops and the jurisdiction, they call the building St. Martin's of Tours. A kind of welcome, a kind of gesture out, even where the language, such is my position, where the open, where the lilac falters, where a contemporary standing, a contemporary stops. A welcome of sorts. We live in a pay-as-you-go environment, and the contract is part of the process, and I'm worried one day the calls will stop. Such is time, even such is time. You call from outside the currency, and the rain is, and the report, March 7th, 12 o'clock. I don't have a strong sense that as a particular poet, I have a political responsibility. In fact, I have no sense of that. But I do absolutely have the sense that when I sit down and do the thing that a person is doing when they're writing a poem, then what I have as my material is the language that's being used. It's important that that language gets scrutinized, and we consider what its implications are and what its values are, who it's including, who it's excluding. These issues are the kind of issues that poems can address. 8. And so the reality is the process doesn't hesitate. In the garden, a cat rips open a garbage bag as the forsythia starts to show, which I can name now since somebody told me, in thick, blocky passages, the way a reckoning unfolds. And the way I reckon it, we should open with the untranslated, born, as I doubt, to all our dole, with the morning in place, since all was not unbeautiful, suddenly holding an emergency at bay. Suddenly, herewith, outwith the politics notwithstanding, for none can call again the passed time. You stop, you do nothing wrong. I'd like to improvise a context, wherewith, somewhere wherewith lilac camped in conversation where the dogwood lies. Here maybe herewith. Sometimes the practice was outsourced to other territories. We look on, we improvise the simplest things last, as the winds blow and the seas and the prospect starts again out of nothing, as the dew starts, as the papers circulate, making it up as you go along. The whole poem is interested in the parts of speech, and especially the small parts of speech that constitute the language's syntax. And right at the end, the word that repeats and recurs is the word as. In that poem, as is both introducing sentences that can't complete and also trying to arrive at a sentence where as is performing some kind of connective function. And it's doing both. It's failing a lot, and then possibly at the end, something like a connection occurs through the word as, but then it doesn't rest there either, because I think the poem then undoes itself one more time, because these terms are at issue and the syntax is at issue, and how people connect through those terms and through that syntax is really exactly the question that the book as a whole is trying to address itself to. 9. As you go as the seas, as you stepped over the threshold, as the winds as the traffic, as the emergency stops, as you wait as nothing happens, as you passed out of the currency, as the letter as after the process, after the aircraft drops, as the contract came good, as a still more intimate model, as without restriction everything is lawful now, as the dew falleth on the grass, as they pay you a deep attention, not even a compliment, as you go about your business, as for whomever inhabited it, as the story breaks, as the process sets out, as the framework sequences arbitrarily, as you came from the holy land of a broken state, sirens, cigarettes, as the small rain graced the language, out with, notwithstanding, as you spoke. We showed up late.